I'm Adam Dagno. I'm assistant professor of forest policy and economics at the University of Maine. And I'm up here as a non-forester and non-biologist speaking about forest ecosystems, forestry, and biodiversity. So maybe like Bob, I lost at the rock, paper, scissors. But I thank all my colleagues who are listed there and all the contributors as well for having faith in me to describe this the best of my ability. So, we've touched upon climate impacts. We've touched upon the marine systems. Let's also talk about sort of Maine's aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems, noting that it's basically the sort of large ecological transition zone that Maine has is basically home to over 30,000 fish and wildlife species, including marine, of which a significant amount are expected to be affected to some degree by climate change. The majority of these species are actually insects, but when we think about charismatic, iconic species of Maine, we think about things like moose, loons, brook trout, of which all will also be affected by climate. So the question we have here is, why do we have so many species in Maine? Well, it's basically because we're this biological transition area where there's more temperate forests characteristic of southern New England in the, sort of in the southern part, as well as these northern boreal forests to our north. And so we're a mixing zone in this area. Where there's actually a number of species that are sort of the edge of their range as a result of that. And so for comparison, and I'm drawing this from Ivan and others that love to talk about this, think about the figure on the right, is essentially Maine's climate gradient exists in just 3 degrees of latitude of Maine, is basically similar to over 20 degrees of latitude in Europe, or the distance of approximately twice the length of California. So it's actually quite a large gradient within Maine that basically allows us to harbor such a diverse set of species. So what makes a species vulnerable to climate change? There's sort of 6 key components: habitat specificity, edge of range, narrow environmental or physiological tolerance, species interactions within these, limited mobility of species, primarily things like plants, right? They can only move so fast if they have roots and not legs. And the sensitivity to things like pathogens and exotic species. That latter one, you can think about sort of how moose ticks have recently sort of affected the moose population and moose health as a good example from that. So that's sort of the broad of what we think about terrestrial ecosystems. Touch upon first, I want to come back to sort of Maine's forests. All right, so again, diverse sort of climatic zone and primary forest types that are located, situated within Maine, of which 89% of state's actual landmass is forest. So we pretty much are all aware of that. It's hard to go anywhere without seeing a tree in the state. Representing roughly 16.6 million acres. And again, this is a mix of this hardwoods primarily to the south and the softwoods to the north, of which that sort of gradient, right, can shift if we follow sort of some of the things that Sean was talking about in the first example, the first presentation. And so kind of a key thing that we think about is Maine's is a key sort of part of the Acadian forest ecoregion, which covers close to 60 million acres, of which we're sort of at the southern range of that. See Pat Strout right in the front, so I can't talk about forest without talking about forest industry, right? By far the largest natural resource sector contributor to the economy in Maine, $8 to $10 billion in economic contributions, depending on how exactly you measure it. It's diverse yet integrated across a number of sectors as well. Maine's rural economy is highly dependent sort of on our forest resources. And it's not just for the sort of the fuel and fiber and timber that it provides, but also the recreation, wildlife habitat, aesthetic benefits that forests provide as well. So the other key thing that Maine's forests provide when we think about it in a climate context, it has a very strong sort of influence on what our total carbon budget is. So again, Sally initially started gave a great overview about Maine's gross greenhouse gas emissions, right? But you might recall that the governor also announced in September that we have an objective to basically make Maine be carbon neutral, or such that our net emissions are 0 by 2045. And a strong contributor to that can be basically the carbon sequestration that's sequestered on our lands, of which recent analysis that colleagues and I have been working on at the University of Maine has tried to assess, well, how much carbon is out there that is basically sequestering carbon in Maine, sort of primarily in the different Maine's land, all right, of which we've estimated that roughly about, existing forests that are growing on a year-by-year basis are roughly offsetting about 60% of the emissions that are being produced by fossil fuels. All right. If you couple that with the fact that we do have an active forest management and harvest regime here in Maine, all right, of that, an additional 15% of the emissions can be offset by essentially converting those logs into things like this podium, furniture, paper, pulp, et cetera. All right. So that actually gets it to that forest has to have currently in its potential to offset close to 75% of Maine's fossil fuel emissions today. Right. If you count other components of Maine's net land sink, like some of the sort of aquatic ecosystems, things like that, maybe we can get up to around 78%. So the key there is that sort of there's already working forests that are doing something to basically help meet that net neutral target. All right, but the key part is that climate can have effect on that, as well as the way that we manage our forests. The reason that we're able to get basically close to that, between 60 and 75%, is because essentially the forests are growing faster year on year than the rate at which we're cutting it, or the amount that we're sequestering is in more long-lasting wood products. All right, so that's a kind of a key dynamic too. It's about sort of the net growth relative to removals and production as well. So with that, I kind of talked about, so the other influence of this is that climate is expected to have an influence on how the actual sort of, species grow, and also what species can basically continue to basically thrive under this situation. So under these projections, we sort of say that there could be higher growth due to longer growing seasons. All right, but that's not necessarily going to be for all species. A lot of the growth is expected to come through different types of hardwoods. All right, where birch and maples appear to be sort of the big winners. Coupled with that, there might also be some species that decline due to either greater droughts and/or pest occurrence. Right, and then so different species have somewhat different tolerances. So it's expected that you could see a decline in a number of spruce species, although balsam fir is expected to remain relatively constant, which are sort of the two major ones that you think of in terms of Maine softwoods. The other thing is that we really have to think about is forest management really has a strong influence on future trends. So I talked about the aspect of this sort of like net growth to removals, right? But it's also sort of what we're doing in our forest, not just in terms of harvesting regime, but also to sort of encourage regrowth, speed up growth of different types of species, that type of component. All right, and the figure, what I'm showing on the right, is essentially the effect that, if you try to hold sort of historical harvest constant, all right, which would be the blue line is essentially what happens without climate change. The red line is what is expected to happen if you try to keep harvest constant, but you account for essentially the effect that climate might have on growth and species shift. So it's saying it's essentially with climate, if you sort of hold all else equal, it's going to overall lower the amount of, essentially the amount of biomass and the amount of carbon that could potentially be out there. All right, suggesting again, thinking about other ways to sort of improve forest management that can help influence getting us close, staying closer to what that blue line might be. All right, so that's sort of the state of forests. Let's also talk about the other sort of aspects of different aspects of the ecosystem, particularly the impacts of climate change on biodiversity. Globally, there's about 3 billion fewer birds in North America since 1970, or 1 in 4 sort of bird species have been lost. There's also been a 75% decline in flying insects in protected areas in Germany over the past 27 years. So it's just another example because Germany is sort of similar to a sort of ecosystem here in Maine. All right, future projections basically indicate that 34 to 58% of species could be faced with extinction if they're unable to shift ranges, right? And so this is where management and connectivity has a big sort of influence on sort of how species can adapt, all right? Particularly if they don't have the ability to sort of rapidly move. And with that, even if they are able to shift, you still can see 11 to 33% potential loss sort of globally in the number of species. So here in Maine, basically, climate change is likely to have an effect on Maine's most at-risk species, some of them there which I brought up earlier. So a recent study of the vulnerability of plant and animal species in natural communities that basically have informed the latest Maine Wildlife Action Plan basically found that of the 378 species determined to be at risk, about 1/3 of them basically in part are at risk due specifically to climate change. All right, and so as a result, basically this action plan, which kind of sits under, managed by DIFW, basically came up with over 50 actions that are in the plan to address issues related to climate stressors on the species and their habitats. All right, and really the key push here is to basically get so that species don't decline such that they're either considered threatened or endangered, and thus have to be managed basically at a more significantly or a higher level because they get listed under the Endangered Species Act. So the real kind of key part of that plan is to basically come up with management options such that they can thrive or survive and not get to that sort of critical level. So most of us are basically, we're all well aware of what moose are. Most of us are also well aware of sort of what's happening to Maine's moose population or the effect of winter ticks on moose. So an example basically here is that, many moose populations at the southern edge of the range in North America, basically think about western Maine and northern New Hampshire, have declined over the last 5 to 10 years, primarily due to increases, or a key component being increases in winter tick outbreaks. All right, winter ticks, they do occur statewide, and they have basically historically, we've experienced short-lived outbreaks, all right, that have caused local declines in moose. However, these outbreaks have basically been more sustained and more frequent. All right, so that's basically leading to more negative impacts, particularly along Maine's southern range. All right, and so with some of the conditions that Sean explained, like increasingly warmer winters, you're going to have sustained winter tick populations in outbreaks, right? And as those sort of gradient of warmer winters continue to shift northward, we're expected to see sort of what you're seeing in southern Maine and northern New Hampshire to sort of continue to creep northward as well. And so another fact is of the 6 vulnerability characteristics we talked about earlier, moose have 2 of those, all right? So it's edge of range, right? And then also sensitivity to pathogens and pests, of which the ticks are the primary one. Okay, moving to something that's a bit closer to the marine side, but still on land, you can think of climate change also has effect on Maine's birds. All right, beaches where piping plovers nest are already subject to more frequent and extreme storms. Pictures that Andy showed, such as eroding beaches, have an effect on beach nesting habitat. Nests get flooded and eggs get washed out. So, and as a result, basically young chicks are subjected to exposure during heavy rainstorms, all right? So this all has a major effect on habitat. And basically, if chicks can't essentially grow, then they're at risk for decline overall. In addition, high tide marsh grasses where salt marsh sparrows nest are being inundated more frequently, literally drowning chicks who are unable to crawl high enough up the grass stems to get above these excessive high tides. All right, so if you think of the different vulnerability characteristics, these species are in some cases edge of range, have limited mobility, all right, particularly when they're nesting, and they have specific habitat that they must adhere to. A couple more. Next is eastern brook trout. So brook trout are really an iconic species to our state. All right, Maine is the last stronghold of brook trout, with over 95% of the remaining lake and pond habitat left in the East Coast, all right, and a majority of streams that are considered already healthy. All right, but things like changes in temperature, water flow, and sedimentation all can threaten their future. All right, as waters warm, the habitat available for these wild brook trout basically is declining. All right, and so as a result, Maine has also another responsibility to think about how to manage for the long-term viability of this species. All right, but the climate doesn't have a negative effect on everything when it comes to sort of species and biodiversity, right? I talked about there's sort of winners and losers in terms of species with forests. It's the same thing with the broader set of species that you want to think of. So one example is that red-bellied woodpeckers are moving north. All right, so this bird did not exist in Maine. You could not find it in 1950s, but today you can find it as far north as Bar Harbor. All right, and it's not an invasive pest or anything like that. It basically is capable of basically, of living in Maine's ecosystems. All right, so it's an example at least of how species have adapted and started to move north, right, and aren't necessarily considered a total negative. So there are winners and losers associated with this, right? And so, it's trying to make something positive out of this situation. All right. And so what I want to then is I just want to sum up with a few summaries and conclusions. So first, that there's many species of habitat of risk of this significant decline, degradation, or extinction with climate change. All right, but there could be some potential winners associated with this. It's not all negative. Second, forests are really likely to shift towards more hardwood species with greater availability and future productivity. All right, but some of that basic productivity can be assisted by management objectives that are dictated by sort of how we as people manage the forests. Third, carbon that's growing in forest and wood products All right, currently offset roughly 75% of Maine's fossil fuel emissions, which is potential for more, and there's potential for more via management shifts that encourage the growth of forests in a more sort of rapid sense. And finally, conserving and connecting geographically diverse landscapes is one of the key recommendations that we have, basically because it can encourage species to shift and respond to climate change in a more natural manner. So, thank you very much.